In 1885, Burma still had a king. His name was Thibaw, the last ruler of the Konbaung dynasty. At the center of his kingdom stood Mandalay, the royal capital, where the palace represented the political heart of Upper Burma. But by the end of November, everything had changed. On November 28, 1885, British forces entered Mandalay and demanded Thibaw's immediate and unconditional surrender. One day later, on November 29th, the last Burmese king walked out of his summer palace beside Queen Supayalat. He was not walking toward another palace. He was walking into exile. 3 young daughters accompanied their parents. Relatives followed. Several former government ministers were also part of the departing household. Servants carried royal clothing and valuables as the family prepared to leave the city forever. And then, the doors of their royal world closed behind them. The British annexation of Upper Burma ended the Konbaung dynasty. The territories that had previously depended on the Burmese king became part of the new British colony, while resistance continued in Upper Burma for roughly another decade. But the fall of the monarchy was only the beginning. Thibaw and Supayalat were sent to Ratnagiri, on the western coast of India, approximately 326 kilometers south of Bombay. The former king would spend the rest of his life there under British control. He would never return to Burma. And this is where the story becomes more than the collapse of a throne. Because the British had not simply removed a ruler. They had uprooted an entire family. For daughters would eventually grow up without a kingdom. A former queen would return to Burma, but be prevented from living in Mandalay. And descendants of the dynasty would spend decades carrying a royal name that no longer guaranteed power, wealth, or even security. The question is no longer who conquered Burma. It is what happened to the people who had once ruled it. The fall of Burma did not begin on November 28, 1885. By the time British troops entered Mandalay, the kingdom had already been weakened by years of pressure, territorial losses, and confrontation with the British Empire. The decisive turning point came through the Anglo-Burmese Wars. After earlier conflicts, Britain had already taken large parts of Burmese territory. By the time Thibaw became king in 1878, the Konbaung monarchy was ruling a kingdom facing an increasingly powerful colonial neighbor. Thibaw was only a young monarch when he inherited the throne. His reign began under intense pressure, while Britain continued expanding its influence around Burma. Then came a final crisis. In 1885, a dispute between the British-controlled Bombay Burma Trading Corporation and the Burmese government became the immediate pretext for British intervention. Britain accused the company of violating Burmese regulations, while Burmese authorities attempted to impose penalties. But the dispute quickly became something much larger. The British government demanded concessions from Thibaw. When his government refused to accept British demands, Britain decided to use military force. British troops advanced toward Mandalay. For Thibaw's government, the problem was not simply one military disagreement. Burma was confronting an empire with vastly greater resources and an established colonial presence surrounding the kingdom. The pressure became impossible to reverse. On November 11, 1885, the British ultimatum demanded that Thibaw accept British terms. The Burmese government refused. Less than 3 weeks later, British forces entered Mandalay. And then, the dynasty that had ruled Burma was suddenly facing its final hours. Thibaw still wore the title of king, but the power behind that title was already disappearing. On November 28, 1885, the end came to Mandalay. British troops had entered the royal capital, and King Thibaw was confronted with a demand that left him almost no room to maneuver: immediate and unconditional surrender. The following day, November 29th, the final scene unfolded. Thibaw appeared at his summer palace beside Queen Supayalat. The king was no longer preparing for a ceremony of power. He was preparing to leave his kingdom. 3 young daughters were with their parents. Relatives, several former ministers, and servants gathered around them. Royal clothing and valuables were packed for the journey. Outside, Mandalay was watching. The royal family passed from the palace into a completely different world. The monarchy that had stood at the center of Burmese political life was being removed in front of its own people. And then, the journey began. The family was taken away under British authority. Thibaw was no longer a sovereign deciding where his court would travel. His destination had been chosen for him. For the people watching, the meaning was unmistakable. The Konbaung dynasty had ended. British forces had defeated the final Burmese monarchy, and the annexation of Upper Burma followed. The royal government disappeared, and the territories that had once belonged to Thibaw became part of the British colonial system. But the humiliation did not end at the palace gates. Thibaw was about to lose something even more important than his throne, his country itself. He would be sent to India, roughly 326 kilometers south of Bombay, to a place called Ratnagiri. There, the last king of Burma would spend the remaining years of his life. He would never see Mandalay again, and for the royal family traveling beside him, exile was only beginning. The journey away from Burma would eventually transform 4 princesses into women who had inherited a royal name, but no kingdom. The journey from Mandalay marked the beginning of a life Thibaw could never have imagined when he became king. On November 29th, 1885, he left the palace with Queen Supayalat and their 3 young daughters. Relatives, former ministers, and servants traveled with them, carrying royal clothing and valuables that had suddenly become possessions of an exiled household. But the most important thing was missing. There was no kingdom ahead of them. The family was transported to Ratnagiri, on the western coast of India, approximately 326 kilometers south of Bombay. For Thibaw, this was not a diplomatic journey and not a temporary visit. British authorities had removed him from Burma and placed him under their control. He would never return. Think about the reversal. A man who had once lived at the center of Burma's monarchy now had to live according to restrictions imposed by the power that had destroyed his throne. The royal title remained attached to his name, but the political authority behind it was gone. Ratnagiri became the family's new world. For the first 14 years, the family lived in relatively cramped accommodation. Later, the British government constructed a much larger residence for them, where more than 100 members of staff worked. From the outside, the residence could still look like a royal household, but appearances were deceptive. Thibaw was no longer ruling ministers, commanding armies, or receiving foreign envoys. He was an exiled monarch living under British supervision, thousands of kilometers from the country that had once been his. And there was a bitter irony here. The British had removed the king, but they could not erase the fact that he remained the last living symbol of Burma's abolished monarchy. His daughters were growing up around that contradiction. They were princesses by birth, but they had no kingdom to inherit. And before long, their lives would reveal just how completely exile had changed the meaning of being royal. The fall of the Konbaung dynasty did not end with Thibaw's removal from Burma. The consequences followed his family into exile and remained there for decades. In Ratnagiri, the former king lived under British control rather than as an independent monarch. His family was separated from the country they had once ruled, while the British authorities controlled where they could live and how freely they could move. The first 14 years were spent in cramped accommodation. Later, the British government built a larger residence for the family, employing more than 100 staff members. But comfort could not restore what had been lost. Thibaw also faced continuing financial problems. According to the research of Sudha Shah, he regularly exceeded his allowance. Members of the household sold or pawned possessions, while money was also spent helping Buddhist monasteries and schools in Mandalay and poor people in Ratnagiri. The contradiction was striking. The former king had lost his kingdom, yet he continued to spend money connected to the people and religious institutions of Burma. Meanwhile, his daughters were growing up in India. Thibaw and Supayalat eventually had 4 daughters, born in Burma and India. Their lives became the clearest evidence that exile had transformed the royal family permanently. One daughter would marry an Indian employee. Another would marry a former royal secretary. And the 2 younger daughters would eventually return to Burma. But returning to their homeland would not mean returning to their old lives. The British authorities would allow Supayalat and the 2 younger daughters to return after Thibaw's death, but they would not allow them to settle in Mandalay. The former royal family was still considered politically sensitive, and the British feared that their presence could become a symbol of Burmese nationalism. So even after decades of exile, the family could not simply go home. They could return to Burma, but not to the city that had once belonged to them. And one of Thibaw's daughters was about to experience an even more painful kind of exile. The clearest measure of a fallen dynasty is not the empty palace. It is what happens to the people who once lived inside it. Thibaw and Supayalat had 4 daughters, and their lives followed very different paths after the monarchy disappeared. The eldest, Mayat Phaya Juai, became the most controversial example of how far the family had fallen. In 1906, when she was 26, she became pregnant by Gopal Sawant, an Indian gatekeeper and driver at the royal residence in Ratnagiri. He was married, and the relationship crossed the enormous social distance between a Burmese princess and an Indian household employee. A child was born from that relationship, Tutu, but royal blood no longer guaranteed a royal future. Mayat Phaya Juai eventually returned to Burma with her daughter, but she later went back to Ratnagiri to Gopal. Her later life became marked by poverty and isolation, an extraordinary contrast with the world into which she had been born. Her sister Mayat Lat followed another unexpected path. She became involved with Konbaung Lat, a former royal secretary. Their relationship also crossed the boundaries that had once governed the royal household. The 2 younger daughters experienced a different fate. After Thibaw's death in 1916, Supayalat and the 2 youngest daughters received permission to return to Burma. For a family that had spent decades in exile, this should have been a homecoming. But Britain still controlled where they could live. They were not permitted to settle in Mandalay, the city where their family had ruled. Instead, they settled in Rangoon. The irony was brutal. The daughters of Burma's last king could return to their homeland, but not to their ancestral capital. Their lives demonstrate what political collapse really meant. One generation had lost a throne. The next had to discover how to live without one. And the story became even darker when the dynasty's descendants entered a Burma still struggling with political violence and uncertainty. Exile did not simply remove the royal family from Burma. It placed them in a life where even their private decisions could have consequences. In Ratnagiri, Thibaw remained under British control. He had lost the authority that once allowed him to make decisions for his kingdom, and his family lived far from the political world they had known in Mandalay. The restrictions were physical, but the deeper danger was the destruction of their old position. The family still possessed royal connections and memories of Burma, yet those connections no longer provided the security they once had. And then, money became another source of pressure. According to Siddha Shah's research, Thibaw repeatedly exceeded his financial allowance. The household therefore faced continuing financial difficulties. Some possessions were sold or pawned, even while money was being used to support Buddhist monasteries and schools in Mandalay and poor people in Ratnagiri. It was a remarkable contradiction. The former king was living in exile, struggling with his finances, while still directing resources toward people and religious institutions connected to the country he could no longer govern. His daughters were also discovering that royal birth could not protect them from difficult personal choices. In 1906, Mayat Phaya Jawai was 26 years old when she became pregnant by Gopal Sawant, an Indian gatekeeper and driver who was already married. Her relationship crossed the social boundaries that had once separated the royal household from ordinary servants. Their daughter, Tutu, became part of a royal family whose political power had already disappeared. Mayat Phaya Jai later returned to Burma with her daughter, but eventually went back to Ratnagiri to Gopal. Her later life was marked by poverty and isolation. There is a bitter irony here. The daughter of Burma's last king had inherited one of the most prestigious names in the country, yet that name could no longer guarantee wealth, freedom, or even stability. And as the family entered the 20th century, the greatest danger was no longer simply exile. It was becoming forgotten. The fall of Burma's last monarchy was not simply a family tragedy. It changed the political structure of the country itself. In 1885, the British annexation of Upper Burma ended the Konbaung dynasty and brought the territories that had depended on the Burmese king into the British colonial system. But removing the monarchy did not immediately create stability. Resistance to British rule continued in Upper Burma for roughly another decade. The disappearance of the royal government created a political vacuum, while British authorities attempted to impose their own administration across territory that had previously been governed through the Burmese monarchy. For the royal family, this transformation was devastating because their identity had been inseparable from the state they represented. Thibaw was no longer a king governing from Mandalay. He was an exiled monarch living in Ratnagiri, and his daughters were no longer princesses preparing for lives inside a royal court. They were growing up in a colonial world where their family's political power had vanished. The consequences reached beyond one generation. The four daughters of Thibaw and Supayalat became living reminders of a monarchy that Britain had abolished. Their marriages, relationships, movements, and eventual return to Burma were therefore not simply private family matters. They were connected to the question of whether the old dynasty could once again become a political symbol. That fear helps explain why, after Thibaw's death in 1916, British authorities allowed Supayalat and the two younger daughters to return to Burma, but refused to let them settle in Mandalay. The former royal capital remained politically sensitive. Instead, they settled in Rangoon. The geography itself told the story. Mandalay had been the center of their world. Ratnagiri represented exile. Rangoon became the place where some members of the family could live after returning home. But none of these places restore the old monarchy. The Konbaung dynasty had become history, and the longer its descendants lived without a throne, the more difficult the question became. Could a royal family survive when the political world that created it had completely disappeared? The death of King Thibaw in 1916 did not end the story of Burma's last royal family. In some ways, it made their future even more uncertain. For more than 3 decades, Thibaw had lived in Ratnagiri, unable to return to the country he had ruled. When he died, Supayalat and the 2 youngest daughters were finally permitted to return to Burma. But the journey home came with a condition. They could not settle in Mandalay. The city where Thibaw had ruled was still considered politically sensitive by the British authorities. The former royal family could potentially become a symbol for Burmese nationalism, so the authorities directed them away from the old capital. They settled in Rangoon instead. For Supayalat, this was an extraordinary reversal. She had once been Burma's queen, living at the center of the royal court. Now she was living in her own country without a throne, without political authority, and without the freedom to return to the city that had once defined her life. Her daughters faced an even more complicated inheritance. They had been born into the final Burmese royal household, but they had grown up after the monarchy had already disappeared. Their marriages and relationships crossed social boundaries that would have been difficult to imagine inside the old palace. Mayatphaya Juwai, the eldest daughter, had already experienced a particularly painful transformation. In 1906, at the age of 26, she had a daughter, Tutu, with Gopal Sawant, an Indian gatekeeper and driver at the Ratnagiri residence. She later returned to Burma with Tutu before eventually going back to Ratnagiri. Her life became a stark contrast between royal ancestry and personal hardship, and the descendants of the four princesses continued living without official royal authority. The dynasty survived biologically, but politically it was gone. That distinction became the defining reality of the family throughout the 20th century. The question was no longer whether the Konbaung dynasty would rule Burma again. It was whether anyone would still remember the people who had once ruled it. Today, the descendants of Burma's last royal family no longer rule a kingdom. The Konbaung dynasty has no throne, no royal government, and no political authority. What survives is the family itself, descendants of the four daughters of Thibaw and Supayalat, carrying the memory of a monarchy that disappeared in 1885. The final king spent the rest of his life in exile. He died in 1916, more than 3 decades after leaving Mandalay. Supayalat and 2 of their daughters eventually returned to Burma, but even then they were prevented from settling in Mandalay. That detail captures the entire tragedy. They could return home, but they could not return to the world they had lost. The palace was gone. The throne was gone. The political system that had given meaning to their titles was gone. And yet the family survived. Their descendants continued living in Burma and India without the privileges that had once accompanied their ancestry. Some experienced comfortable lives. Others, like Mayatphaya Juwai, face poverty and isolation. Their stories reveal something that the collapse of an empire often hides. Political destruction does not end when the flag changes or the soldiers leave. It continues inside families for generations. There's a bitter irony here. A royal name can survive for centuries, but a kingdom can disappear in a single generation. The story of Burma's last royal family is therefore not really about losing a crown. It is about losing an identity, a home, and a future that once seemed permanent. When Thibaw left Mandalay on November 29, 1885, nobody could know what his daughters and grandchildren would face. But they inherited something more complicated than a throne. They inherited the memory of a vanished country. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe to the channel. Here, we follow the human lives hidden behind the collapse of empires and dynasties. And consider this. If your family had lost its country but kept its name, would you protect that heritage or choose to leave it behind?